Start.
Okay, welcome to our Inclusive Excellence Forum. Thank you for joining us today. Before I turn over to our host, Vice Chancellor Douglas Haynes, I just wanted to go over some brief items with you. One is our forum is being recorded, as you know, and the recording will be available through our OIE website. We also will ask you to submit questions for any Q&A that's possible. And if you'd use your chat feature to do so, we'd appreciate it. We also wanted to just highlight to many members who are planning to attend the UCI Town Hall at 1 o'clock today that we intend on finishing no later than 12:50 p.m. We might finish a bit earlier than that. You can feel free to scan if you have not registered yet for the UCI Town Hall. Just scan the QR code to register. And the live streaming, we'll be putting this in our chat later on, but this is, they'll also have a location where you can live stream. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and welcome Vice Chancellor Douglas Haynes. Thank you.
Thank you, Marguerite. Good morning, colleagues. And I just want to welcome you to this annual Inclusive Excellence Forum on this beautiful day in Southern California. Of course, my name is Douglas Haynes and my pronouns are he, him, and his. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's forum. And I'm particularly grateful that you've made time today to be in community with us. This annual event is an opportunity to join with partners, meaning you and others across UCI, to focus on the status of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and our efforts to advance these ideas. We'll use the time today to hear from engaging speakers. We'll also solicit and entertain questions from and answers from the presenters. And my colleagues and I at OIE will take stock of what we learn about the themes to integrate further into the UCI action plan for inclusive excellence. As Marguerite mentioned, I want to encourage you to share your questions throughout today's program by using the chat feature. We'll have some time after our featured presentations for question and answers as time permits. We'll have then a conversation around Let's Thrive with a panel representing different parts of the UCI campus. And thereafter, we'll have student reflections by leaders of the UCI elected officers. And of course, we want to end by around 12:45. So those of you who have registered or will be registering can attend the town hall with Chancellor Gilman. Our theme for this year's forum is Let's Thrive Together in 2021. And it embodies the hope as well as the practical steps that we need to make to ensure community thriving and wellness this year and beyond. The three themes of community thriving and wellness are emphasized in the UCI action plan. And my hope is that from today, from what we learn, from our discussion in the forum, that these three concepts will become even more deeply rooted and manifest in our daily practices and lives at UCI. In arriving at this year's theme, I was struck by the fact that in January 2020, we launched the Inclusive Excellence Action Plan after more than a year of listening to the campus community. It seems almost like ancient history now. At the time, no one imagined then that we would face a global pandemic, an economic crisis, and a painful national reckoning on anti-Black racism. The cascade of impacts has demanded so much from each of us, from our families, from our communities, and indeed the world. These impacts of the pandemic, of the economic crisis, of the continuing reckoning have elevated the relevance and urgency of the pillars of the Inclusive Excellence Action Plan for all of us. Community is for all of us. Thriving is for all of us. Wellness is for all of us. So in 2021 finds us facing some of the largest challenges that we've ever faced as an institution, as a nation, and as a global community. I want to emphasize we in my comments because even though our individual experiences in life now may be unique, no one is enduring these challenges and changes alone. It is for this reason that I appreciate that our presentation today will highlight the importance of community thriving and wellness and balance that with constant attention to lessons learned and practical strategies for building a future where all expect equity, support diversity, and practice inclusion. Even though we enter 2021 facing these challenges, I also want to acknowledge that this campus, this community has achieved so much already. This year is the 20th anniversary of UCI receiving the National Science Foundation Advance Award for advancing gender equity in STEM. It has had a transformational impact on our faculty, and it continues to have an impact among our graduate students and undergraduates. This year is also important for another reason, and I want to acknowledge UCI Health not only for their heroic efforts in confronting this pandemic, but for receiving from the Human Rights Campaign the Leadership Index for serving the LGBTQ community in Greater Orange County. Today, I take particular pride in advising that UCI received the Bronze Award from the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. The Bronze Award is notable for several reasons, not least because it's a distinction being recognized by a global organization for our achievements and commitments in advancing diversity in STEM fields. But it's important for the energy and expertise that UCI gains by mobilizing its internal partners and the external sea change community in the real work ahead to advance diversity and inclusion so that they extend not only in STEM, but across our entire enterprise. When thinking of the potential for impact, there was no better speaker to invite to lead us in this conversation than Director Shirley Malcolm, who leads the Sea Change Initiative at AAAS. Dr. Malcolm serves as the Director of Sea Change and has been a senior advisor at AAAS. She works to improve the quality of and increase the access to education and careers in STEM. Dr. Malcolm has received broad recognition for her efforts and serves as a trustee of Caltech, a region of Morgan State University, and a former member of the National Science Board, the policymaking body of the National Science Foundation. She earned her master's degree in zoology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her doctorate in ecology from the Pennsylvania State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shirley Malcolm as she discusses sea change, building a thriving community. Shirley?
Thank you so much. I had to unmute first. Sometimes we forget to unmute. And so I am going to start that and start sharing my screen. I want to thank the Vice Chancellor for having me and having Sea Change represented so prominently here in this, what is clearly a special day and a special event for the University of California, Irvine. Yes, build a thriving community. And by coming in as a part of Sea Change, what UCI has done is had joined other communities of striving institutions that are trying to make a difference and trying to be better and trying to make sure that we have diverse and inclusive communities. Yes, in STEM, and I told the vice chancellor, I said, I say STEM first because we're the worst, but across the entire campus. I think that we all can agree that our lives are made better because of the diversity that's in it. Imagine having to eat the same thing every day. Imagine having to read the same thing every day. Imagine having to talk to the same people every day. I get ideas from the different people that I engage with from the different communities, and that in fact, I value that highly. I was born and raised in Birmingham, and in Birmingham, Alabama, at the time where when I was raised, it was a segregated city, in a very segregated state. And there wasn't the same opportunity to engage with people from different communities. But as I pursued higher education, first in Seattle, Washington, then in Los Angeles, and then subsequently at Penn State, I had the opportunity to meet all different kinds of people from all different walks of life. So the question is, how do we make this case? How do we make this case for diversity? I can make a moral argument that we have the right to engage and uh, to need diverse communities. The demographic trends basically tell us we've got to be able to figure out how to value diversity, because quite frankly, the people who are coming down the line are incredibly diverse. The social justice issues have been brought home to us it hugely over 2020. But in our case, there is this additional issue. Diversity is critical to excellence in STEM. Actually, diversity is critical to excellence in all fields. Uh, you will find scholars like Scott Page who talk about the fact that you gain a lot more. You get a boost by having diversity. Diversity in terms of people working together and coming together and problem solving, come up with many, many more ideas, and that you have a chance uh, to really improve in terms of innovation and creativity and the like by grabbing hold of diversity. I want to start by talking a little bit about sea change and where that name came from, because quite frankly, it's kind of in our regular lexicon when we talk about things making major transformation. But when I went in search of the kind of the where the roots were, at least the early uses, I ended up with Shakespeare. Who knew? This is Ariel's song from The Tempest. Full fathom five, thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. And it relates to the fact that the changes that are wrought by the sea. But in our case, what we wanted to do was to talk about how can we have a sea change in terms of the culture of our field. So we look at these issues of culture. What do we mean by merit in STEM culture? What do we mean by being invited to the table doesn't mean we're included in the conversation? And the notion of baked in bias from systemic societal change. Now, after the killing of George Floyd, AAAS redoubled our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this comment comes from our CEO, Sudeep Parikh, who talked about the fact that we had been challenged, as they said, to stick to our science. That issues of systemic racism are not in our purview and not worthy of our time and attention. He said, I disagree. The success of the scientific enterprise is absolutely dependent on an open, diverse, and inclusive workforce that looks like the society we all seek to serve. That's a bold statement that essentially says we can't just put it off to the side. So, what do we gain by being inclusive? Multiple perspectives and problem solving, greater creativity and innovation, greater accuracy in predictions, more return on investment from our R&D, and importantly here today, a thriving community. Another element of sea change really relates to the kind of hope that comes with sea change. These are verses from The Cure at Troy by Seamus Heaney. And for those of you who are not familiar with this poem, you haven't been paying attention because we had lines from this poem actually included by several presidents, most recently by President Biden in his inaugural address when he talks about hope in history rhyming. But in our case, what we are looking at here is an expression of going forward. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. Oftentimes you don't hear the next verse, but I listed here. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. You might find it interesting that Seamus Heaney wrote this poem in honor of Nelson Mandela when he was released from prison and was basically going out into South Africa to begin to establish a new South Africa. So there's a social justice theme here as well as a theme that relates to the hope we all carry about the future. So what is sea change? In sea change, we are a transformational strategy. We are a community. And what membership gives us is community, yes. It also gives us an institute, a place where we can come together and learn together and share. And it also gives recognition, such as that which UCI has recently received based upon its hard work of looking at itself, the self-assessment, self-reflection that basically says this is this is who we are, this is what we need, and this is how we have to go further. Now, in our case, the Institute provides a repository of resources, trainings, and webinars, all kinds of things to build capacity. And the community provides a safe space for the kinds of conversations that we have to have in order to make a change, for communities of learning and practice to come together, for just us within the family to come together, to talk about how we can be better together. We've stood up a platform, Sea Change Port of Call, as a place to learn, to find resources and build community. And we're going to be launching that soon as that space where we will encourage the kinds of conversations that we all need. I mentioned the Institute. These are, this is a recently passed series that we had talking about leaving revisited that looked at the research about why we lose people when we lose them from STEM. But I think that it speaks larger to why we lose people when we lose them, period. The kinds of assumptions that get made and the kinds of assumptions that we have to discard. Diversity, handbook on diversity in the law. We have an issue here of, in some cases, I know within the state of California, but certainly nationally as well, where there are, even as we strive toward our diversity goals, some things are more allowable than others, and we have to be careful in terms of the things we do. So we're trying to help institutions understand what those things are and what they aren't. And then the most recent series, Building Gender Equity in the Academy, learning from the 20 years of NSF Advance. And you have lessons that you have internalized. And these are lessons that come from the experiences of many different institutions. Now, we understand that when we're going to change an institution in a way that is systemic, that you can't just have top-down effort. You have to have bottom-up efforts. You got to have grassroots. The grassroots have to work for change in the same time that the administration and those who are in the leadership roles have to work for change. And you have to meet in the middle in order to really achieve systemic transformation. And that's what we have with Sea Change, working with professional societies and other groups to help support that grassroots upward movement. We have a biomedical component to Sea Change, and I think that none of you can forget the fact that we are seeing some really serious health inequities right now and disparities. And so this is a movement whose time has come, and it is a movement. It's not a moment. Systemic cultural change in institutions, providing an ecosystem of support, a tidal wave of justice and purpose, but remembering that change takes time. Now, in 2018, John Lewis was the commencement speaker at Caltech. And I was honored to be able to sit next to him at lunch, and we shared our roots from Alabama. But as he talks to the students at Caltech, and as he talked to students everywhere, and to the faculty and those others who were helping to shape them, he said some things that are really, really important. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. 2020 was a rough year, people. And quite frankly, coming out through that kind of times, we were really pretty despairing. Would this ever be over? Will we be able to deal with this? But John Lewis said, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. It's interesting that on the day of his funeral, that it was discovered, it was uncovered that he had left a letter to the future, to the students, to the young people, to essentially pass the torch from the people of his generation to the people of the next generation. Never, never really ever give up on trying to make good trouble, on trying to make the pieces come together. 2020, as I said, was a period of disruption. But we've got to build a thriving community from that disruption. To a certain extent, I think that it's kind of like a sea change. Um, this is another example of a sea change. Mollusks, they could take me away from the zoology. You can't take the zoology out of me. Mollusks actually, if they have an irritant that comes under their into their mantle, they secrete nacre around it, called mother of pearl, and it's a biomineral, and they lay down thin layers and thin layers and thin layers, and they continue to lay down these layers so that it's not the irritant that it started out being, from the disruption to a thriving community, or from an irritant to a pearl. That's the kind of metaphor that we want. The small laying down of kindness and goodness, the small laying down of community every single day. And you end up with a pearl, or in our case, a community that thrives. Thank you so much. And I am open to questions.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Malcolm, so much for your remarks. Um, I want to ask a question, but I also want to encourage others. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat and we'll be sure to get to them if time permits. You know, you've described how sea change is has arrived at a particular moment of time that is characterized by disruption
Yes.
that many people have been experiencing in their personal and professional lives, whether they be undergraduates, graduate students, or career staff employees,
That's
as
right.
well as our faculty employees. And I- I'd like to know what are some of the levers of change? How does sea change speak to individuals? How can individuals connect with sea change and see their contribution as a lever of change?
Well, one of the things that I think that you're aware of is that with membership in Sea Change for UCI, that you have the opportunity to participate in a lot of these kind of capacity building activities, and they aren't just like listening to people. In many cases, we will have opportunities for people to break out into groups and to discuss what they are going through and what they're experiencing. And it's like, and sometimes what we need is validation that
Mhm,
we are not crazy
mhm,
or that what we are doing makes sense.
mhm,
And I think that being in that kind of a community and joining communities and creating communities within Sea Change gives people an opportunity to not only share their experiences, but to be validated
mhm,
that in fact and encouraged.
mhm,
Because in many cases, this is work that you may not see the difference you make
mhm,
immediately.
mhm,
And I think that the notion of change is a daunting one, but in fact, it is one that we have to go through. And as a matter of fact, I think that it may only be possible for us to go through this level of change at this point in time because our disruptions have been so profound.
mhm,
And so that gives an opening to
mhm,
do things differently, to think differently. Even faculty who are used to teaching in room 2701, 2701 was not an available space to anyone. So all of a sudden, they had to think differently, not only in terms of the delivery structures, but even what am I going to say? How am I going to engage people? How am I going to do this differently? I don't have the same tools. I've got to think about this in a very different way.
Sure, sure. Thank you. I want to ask a question that was provided in the chat with my colleague, Professor Michael Yassa. And he asked, could you speak a bit more to the departmental award mechanism? This
Yes.
seems like a great way to encourage departments to engage in self-study, to plan and move in a positive direction.
Yes.
Can this be implemented?
Well, that's a part that is in progress. And as a matter of fact, because it is in progress, you have an opportunity to say something about it.
Mhm,
Our colleagues, for example, in physics and astronomy, have been the first out of the gate.
mhm,
They have come together. They have this being through the professional societies, AAPT, APS, AIP, Optical
mhm,
Society, and Society of Black Physicists, Hispanic Physicists, and the astronomers.
mhm,
They've come together and they talk about what is it about our department that presents barriers? What is it about our field that presents barriers?
mhm,
And I think that that anybody can actually start this conversation because most fields tend to have a set of research
mhm,
that people have begun to undertake. Some of the discipline-based DBER or discipline-based education research, but also research about climate, research about the access to the resources that people need.
mhm,
There are these kinds of structures that are out there. I don't know whether you have had an opportunity to have Picture a Scientist on your campus,
mhm,
the movie, but it offers a real good jumping off point for
mhm,
departments to begin to talk about what does it take for success in our department, and does everyone have equal access to it?
mhm.
To
Right,
begin to ask the question, who comes in, who applies, who gets
right,
in,
right,
do they stay?
right.
If they leave, do we know why they leave? In
So
many cases, people will say, well, people go out in these fields because they're not interested. Not true. Or they say people aren't in these fields because they can't cut it. Not true.
right.
It's a difference between coming, and some of our students come underprepared because
Mhm,
their K-12 experiences have not been adequate. Some of them come not really understanding the work patterns that have to shift from what you did in
mhm,
high school to what you do in college. Or they have come without really understanding that
mhm,
help seeking behavior is a good thing,
right.
and that it doesn't say anything about your not being able to make it. So it's these kinds of strategies and questions that departments could really benefit from. These kinds of questions about their own practices and the outcomes that really range from those practices. But it means you got to have the data. You got to be able to collect this and understand what it is that you're dealing with. Because if you can't see it, you can't deal with it.
Thank you. I want to mention another question in the chat, but I just want to make a comment that one of the compelling aspects of sea change is institutional transformation by equipping more people to be aware, to
Right.
have greater competencies, to understand and to row in the same direction. And I want to make a point of acknowledging that our career staff are an integral part of sea change here at UCI. In many ways, our career staff have tremendous contact with our undergraduates, graduate students, and our faculty, both in our STEM areas as well as non-STEM, right? And so I just want to be sure to underscore that and then turn to a question by my colleague, Radha. He's asking, thank you so much for the talk. Can you say more about how to connect what he calls the chipping away methodology with a systemic transformation?
First of all, you basically have to know where you want to go. I mean, after all, when we would drive from between Atlanta and Maryland, we knew where we wanted to go, but you do it 1 mile at a time.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the kind of strategy that you have got to employ.
Mhm,
And you have got to give yourself milestones along the way. Now, what does that mean?
mhm.
Well, we'll do breakfast in X. We need to gas up again in Y. We need to do lunch at Z. You know, you have to chunk this in a way that you can basically celebrate whatever the milestones are. But at the same time, you're clear on the destination. That is the key point. When the action plan was put together, with the vice chancellor and his team were working on this with the rest of the community, one of the things that they asked is, where do we want to go? Where do we want to be? And then after that, it's a lot clearer. You know, if you want to go to Florida, you don't drive north. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you've got to understand where the opportunities are to quote unquote chip away at it or lay down layers of nacre.
Right.
The really thing that I want you to understand about nacre is people have become very, very interested in it because it is resilient.
Mhm,
All right.
mhm,
As a biomineral, it is resilient. And
mhm.
I think during these times, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at tools for resilience. And this means strategies that interact with the way that we reflect on what we're doing, but also those that work with regard to how we interact with others.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Professor Radha Krishna, for that question. He's a former equity advisor, and he's a real partner in this work. And I want to reserve the last minute to a colleague, Dr. Brian Sato, who's really leading a campus-wide effort to really transform teaching and learning. And his question is, many STEM faculty are hesitant to have discussions regarding culture change. Do you have recommendations beyond presenting data to convince the department of the need to have meaningful discussions in this area?
Uh, I know the STEM people won't believe anything but their own data. And I think that they need to see their data. They need to understand what their data mean and what they don't mean. Um, one of the things about talking about Leaving Revisited, and you might want to just actually start a book club around it, because there is a one part that is really important. We tend to think that people leave because they can't cut it. Oftentimes, it's the smartest people who leave. They don't have to put up with poor teaching, poor course design,
Mhm.
basically being asked to memorize and not understand. I mean, those kinds of things. So they go someplace else where they feel as though can get a better experience.
Right.
And I think that in many cases, we've got to have the hard conversations with among the faculty. What is it that you think is happening?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then what is it that's really happening?
Mhm.
Because you've got to create some dissonance,
Mhm.
and you've got to undo the myths. The mythology is killing us, about who can and cannot be successful. That mythology is killing us.
Dr. Malcolm, I want to thank you on behalf of UCI for making time to join us this morning at our annual Inclusive Excellence Forum. I truly appreciate your leadership. We are looking forward to working vigorously with you and AAAS to be a national model through Sea Change, because I think we're ready for transformation. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day and stay warm.
Well, thank you. Yes, I am a little bit chillier here, but please, I am so grateful to UCI for this opportunity. And I'm exceedingly grateful for the kind of comradeship, colleagueship that we have been able to establish with Doug and Marguerite and the team, because only that way are we going to be able to move ahead. So I really appreciate it. And I'm going to sit here for a little bit. I'm going to turn off my camera. I'm going to mute myself, and I'm just going to sit here and soak it in.
Thank you so much. And that is a wonderful opportunity to move to the next featured presentation. And I think it's fair to say it's an understatement that COVID-19 has and continues to impact our ways of work and living. And for that reason, I'm particularly pleased that as we think about the challenges ahead, and they're real, that UCI will draw upon the expertise of many people on this campus in Irvine and in Orange, including our next speaker, Dean Bernadette Bolden Albala, of the School of Population and Public Health. Dean Bolden Albala joined UCI in 2019, which seems like ancient history after the past 2 years, as director of the program in public health. And her renowned research to help reduce health disparities for America's disadvantaged communities could not be more timelier. I welcome her today to discuss some considerations for wellness in the UCI community as we reflect on, and this is the key part, lessons learned and where they may be best applied in the future to foster wellness. Dean Albala.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loudly and clearly.
Okay, and let's just make sure we're doing this. Can you hear me and see me? We're good.
We're golden.
Great, thank you. And it's really such an honor to be here amongst all of my colleagues and to really talk about an experience that not just I have had or public health has had, but we have all had this year, and really thinking about health and wellness during and after COVID-19. And I really wanted to begin this brief conversation today, or brief talk, with a definition of public health, a very simple definition, which is that public health is really about achieving health and wellness in the community. And in public health, community comes first. And that's one of the big differences in some ways between medicine and public health. Community comes first, and sometimes that means it's at odds with individual rights. And I want us to really focus now as we go through this 15 or so minute journey. UCI is our community, and that's what we're going to talk about. And then we are a community within a larger community of Orange County. And I really thought about, and Doug and I have had some conversations, and I didn't speak to Dr. Malcolm before, but I'm very happy that some of her themes resonate, I think, in this presentation. And I really want to spend the time today talking a little bit differently than the talks I typically give, but really talking about our narrative, UCI's narrative in resiliency against COVID. And that is really then thinking about where we have been and where we are going. And it's only a little bit more than a year ago when we really all first understood that we were going to have this problem. In late January, the chancellor convenes a COVID response team, and we just move forward. And, that early COVID response, our community was really fraught with some sense of anxiety. What was this virus? We don't know anything about it. Uncertainty, stigma was beginning to develop, especially among our Asian students, fear. And in that moment, there were many things we could do. And if you look at communities and universities across the country, there were many that didn't respond at all and just waited. But we already responded despite our initial concerns and reactions. And we started this enhancement, this preparedness, looking at what we knew about viruses, trying to raise awareness of health, spread the word, not the virus, thinking about intervention strategies for all of us, including our students, and getting our students involved early on in some of this really sort of preventative behavior. And we went from January, February, March, from hand washing and thinking about not handshaking to social distancing and sheltering in place. And by March, we had already started as a community here and in Orange County to flatten that curve when other places like New York and Chicago were really starting to escalate a curve, which produced, as we know, a lot of morbidity and a lot of mortality. And as we sheltered in place in March and April, flattening that curve, our work here as a university, our research work with Orange County Healthcare Agency, picked up something that was so unnerving, so frightening, so frustrating, that COVID was in fact a disease of disparities. And, looking at the trajectory of COVID positivity, and then we know COVID poor prognostic outcomes and death was greatest among our Latinx populations. And we knew from reports around the country that this finding of a disease of disparities was all over the place. And so we as a community moved from preparedness to sheltering to starting to think about this as a disease of disparities. And at the same time, as Dr. Malcolm mentioned, we had the murder of George Floyd. We had a Black Lives Movement, anti-Black racism. We had anger as a community at a fragmented infrastructure. And we were trying to control COVID and trying to deal with the blatant social inequities. And we were trying to move forward as a university of higher education. And at that and I really feel this is the darkest time for us here as a university. We experience this anger and pandemic fatigue. Who knew that we would still be in the pandemic? So we were thinking pandemic fatigue at 3 months or 4 months in, this rising sense in our community of apathy and exhaustion and impatience from being at a constant state of high alert, not just here, obviously, but throughout the country. Despair, a lack of normalcy, the wedding that got postponed, the parent whose last year of life was going to be sheltered in place without their family member, the child that's born and others can't come and celebrate that we had impacts as a community on mental health with depression, again, higher than we've seen it in modern times. But, and this is the very important and I think joyous component of this, our resolve and our resiliency turned our frustration into productivity. And so at the very same time that we are hitting pandemic fatigue, we are thinking about ways to address COVID, to try and make things better. And there's this research rollout and adjustment to a prolonged response. And that really is about thriving. And Doug talks about thriving in the face of adversity. And so the School of Medicine and the College of Health Sciences start talking about we should be rolling out pilot awards. We should have seed money. We should be addressing COVID here right now in our school, in our community, and that expands to all of the UCI schools. And there is this activity around June and July where people are really starting to contribute really important ideas to really sort of help the COVID discussion, to enhance our knowledge of COVID and to reduce the COVID morbidity and mortality issues. And these just represent some of these wonderful ideas. At the same time, we were compelled, our students, our faculty and staff, to address COVID as a disease of disparities, going out and working with our county community to say, yes, this is bad. It's not just that Latinx folks are dying, but they are getting it at faster rates. One of the highlights of, I think, what we did this summer, which was, a collaboration, a partnership between our leadership, our grad division, our students, and our schools, was a health equity contact tracing workshop where within the lens of health equity, we train our graduate students, not just graduate students from medicine or nursing or pharmacy or public health, but from the humanities whose major is dance, and from social ecology and engineering. And we create a workforce of contact tracers. And we do that alongside our workforce of community health workers. And we do so much more. And in preparation then for fall 2020, we have come up with a model, because COVID is not going away, and in fact surges in August. And this model of contact tracing and testing and quarantine isolation becomes the mantra within which we experience our education. And so we have this workforce of our students who do more than just say, hello, you have COVID, we are isolating you, and in fact provide social work and food and solve problems. And our testing is a ramp up, and everybody on this campus, from the provost's office and the chancellor's office to to HR, to our faculty, to our staff, are involved in components of this, and housing in quarantine and isolation. And so we come together as a community to solve the problems, the challenge of higher education and providing security for the students that need to be on campus and getting education, and the students that are off campus at the same time. And we have done a tremendous job. When I gave a talk, maybe to you all the last time, we were talking about colleges that had, oh my goodness, more than 100 students with COVID. We are at 666 to date and going. And we have cared for them and isolated them and protected our community at the same time. And this is, it started out early on in the fall, slowly, and between Thanksgiving and the winter holidays, we really saw this surge, just as we've seen it with the county. So we experienced a second surge, but we were in this to really address and fight this. And UCI as a community has come together to tackle the surging COVID cases. We've seen it with the makeshift tents in our hospital. We've seen it with the continued testing, and we've seen it with now vaccine distribution to those eligible for vaccine. And UCI is full of unsung heroes. In fact, every one of us, every one of you is a hero in some way, helping to try to make our community healthier and well. And so here we are now. We are in the tunnel. It still exists. COVID will continue until we basically vaccinate almost everyone. But the important thing is there is light at the end of that tunnel. And we have a vaccine. Where we're going, we have a vaccine, Moderna and Pfizer, and that is good. These are good vaccines. There are other vaccines coming down the pike. They are good. They are efficacious. These two vaccines are some of the very best vaccines that are out there today for any disease. And there should be very little hesitancy, although there is, about taking these vaccines. But our challenges now, where we are going, our big challenge that we have very little control over, but we have a voice: national, state, and local distribution of vaccination. And I know that there's going to be some discussion at the town hall meeting next on this, but we must always be in there for the fight for equitable vaccine distribution. And our communities in Orange County are very angry, and I, as a public health person, very angry, because there hasn't been equitable distribution, even within the tiers that are being vaccinated right now. We have got to make sure that the urgency for vaccination continues. There are mutant strains, which people have spoken about, which demand a vaccine response immediately. We don't know yet about how long these vaccines last. And as I indicated before, accessibility and hesitancy will not lead to achieving herd immunity. And we really must be talking about why people are hesitant to get vaccine. And in our community here at UCI, in our community in Orange County. So these are still things we have to come together. And the continued risk mitigation efforts, even when vaccinated. Why should somebody who's vaccinated continue risk mitigation? And it's because it's part of a commitment to save lives. And so, if you've got somebody who's vaccinated and they have two friends over, and the friends say, I'm not going to get COVID, even though I haven't been vaccinated because my friend's been vaccinated. Well, the two friends could give each other COVID. So we still don't know yet. And so mitigation until we've really gotten everything under control. So what does UCI look like in a post-vaccine world? What's the plan for 2020? In-person education with caveats. That's what we're hearing from the chancellors throughout the UC. And I think higher education has learned a lot about its capacity to teach remotely, and will build upon the strengths of that remote teaching as it adjusts to wherever we are by August or September. There'll be discussions around on whether we mandate a vaccine or not. Here on campus, if you remember, flu vaccine was mandated last year, but we can't even begin to do vaccine mandates until we have vaccines removed from EUA and emergency use only, and have real FDA approval of that. And so while the discussions continue, the mandate will not. And the other really important criteria for mandate is accessibility. And so we cannot and should not mandate a vaccine if we do not, or we are not able to provide accessibility to everyone equitably on campus. And so our lives will be determined, in fact, in September, in large by the proportion of UCI population that is vaccinated. If 80 or 85% of the 50,000 who are part of our UCI community are vaccinated, then we will be close to achieving some herd immunity, and we will be less likely to have outbreaks. If 55 or 60% of folks are vaccinated, well, that's great, but we will have outbreaks, and there will be some people who will still get COVID. And so, and we don't know what's going to happen. And to anticipate this, testing and contact tracing will still be the norm, and risk mitigation strategies will still continue. And what will we be as we have turned the curve, the corner? How will we be in terms of wellness and recovery and resiliency? And this is going to be a big challenge. We've done so well. We are so resilient. We pick ourselves up and we go back in and we fight the good fight. Things will be better as vaccines are distributed, but the new normal will be a different normal. There are long-term consequences of COVID. We are hearing discussions about post-COVID sequelae, different kinds of post-viral symptoms. People that were great runners with COVID are having difficulty still catching their breath. There are comorbidities, not from COVID per se, but from a year and a half sheltered where people didn't go and take care of themselves and seek advice. And so we will start to see diabetes and chronic diseases on the rise again. And we will continue to fight for health equity because we haven't solved the problem. We will be a community who is resilient, but there will be depression. There will be feelings of vulnerability. We will be grieving a life that we left behind because things will not really be the same. And it will be a time to heal and a time to heal together. And so we will continue on together. Everyone in our community is valued and everyone has made a big impact. And so I'm going to end with the chancellor's, what is always on when the chancellor sends our emails, but when each of us works together, we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Bodnabala, for those remarks. I think they were so important because you helped to sort of level set, to describe our context, how UCI as a community has been affected, has responded, and has continued to respond to the effects of COVID. And I want to invite members of the audience to share questions through chat. This is a great opportunity to engage with one of the world's leading authorities on COVID and our public health strategies. There is a question about you, Dr. Bodnabala. Did you expect this when you joined UCI in 2019?
I expected the great California weather and the Pacific Ocean is what I expected, and a good challenge, but no. You know, we always have talked in public health about pandemics and about the big pandemics, and I have to say that I was very happy to have experiences doing work in Ebola and polio eradication, really from communications and behavioral strategy ends. But this is, what you always talk about, but you never expect it to happen. And I have to say, I'm very proud that it happened here. I think back about other places that I have been at, and I think about UCI, and I have to say that yeah, there were difficulties the whole way. There always are in these kind of situations, but the leadership has really been extremely supportive of all of us, and I think inspirational. And so while I didn't expect this, I couldn't think of a better place to be involved in this while this was happening.
Good. We're glad to have you as well. Again, I want to urge audience members, you have questions, this is a great opportunity for this Q&A segment. I want to ask another question, Dean Bowden-Abala, and it has to do with both what people are experiencing, but also what you described as what will change and how we will recover. And you mentioned that there's this sense of grieving, right, about the world that we have lost. And that understandably is a source of anxiety, fear, and concern for everyone, for our undergraduates, our graduate students, for our career staff employees, for our career faculty employees, indeed for the more than 200,000 alums of UCI, and over 60% live in Southern California. Do you have any advice about how to both recognize this phenomenon, but also to sort of learn through it?
Yeah.
Because it can be incredibly overwhelming if you don't have a word, a definition to define it, and tools and practices, not just to cope, but to grow out of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that everybody will have experienced this. I am sure that over the last year plus that there's been a time that people have just sort of broken down, and not just everything has just sort of been overwhelming. I think that you should identify when you're having a lot of problems, when you can't move forward, knowing, feeling grief, feeling loss, and you should really get help, get resources, be part of something else. We didn't talk about isolation, but there's a huge feeling of isolation. And even if you're with someone, right? I always talk about the folks that ended up being together that don't like each other, living in a house for a year and a half or whatever it is. But getting help and identifying the melancholy, identifying the hopelessness, and really trying to say, this is a problem, we're in COVID, and this is probably related to that. So I do think that we need to get resources. And I think part of working through it is probably thinking about the new things, a start over, if you will, trying to figure out what is hopeful and really acting on what is hopeful to move forward.
Thank you so much. And I want to add that we'll be providing links to the employee counseling services, as well as the student counseling center as well. Just to underscore, there are ways for you to access these valuable resources as part of a response to processing this pandemic. I have another question, and this is a broader question. And again, I want to encourage folks to submit questions if you have time. And the question really has to do with something you mentioned about recognizing how COVID exposed disparities. And I really would love it if you can sort of reflect on, to what extent do you believe that the experience of COVID will lead to new attitudes, new approaches to not only recognizing disparities, but also how to address them so that we're not simply waiting for the next pandemic.
Well, so in some ways, COVID has given us a test of whether we are patient or not, right? But on things that we can't be patient on, we have become more vocal. And I think that I even feel for myself that there have been times when I would have just, patiently said, I disagree. This is a social determinant. I'm going to write a paper. But instead have said, no, you're wrong. It's time to make a change. And I think that there is a movement, as Dr. Malcolm said, a movement now that is about change. And so I don't know if social determinants of COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement coming together, I don't know if that sort of perfect storm for change, would have occurred had there not been COVID. But I do know that since there is COVID and since there are terrible disparities, not just in the disease, but in all health policies around this disease, now even thinking about vaccine distribution, that we cannot be patient anymore. And I think that our voices together will move into strong change.
Thank you so much. We have time for about one more question. I want to give this opportunity to Dean of the Gross School of Nursing, Adi Yamathi. She has a really, I think, important question. How do you see the role of the Chief Wellness Officer in pushing forward the hard work that we need to do in terms of wellness? And of course, the Chief Wellness Officer is a position that the campus has prioritized. I'm understanding that currently there's ongoing consideration about moving that forward. But how do you see the Chief Wellness Officer as playing a role in promoting wellness, particularly as we get through the urgency of the pandemic?
So I think we've spent a lot of time, not just here at UCI, but among all universities around the country, in being reactive to a measles outbreak, reactive to STD outbreaks, reactive to depression and suicide. And I think the social determinants of health, the concept of it, that health is more than just not feeling well, but in fact about our structural environment, that the Chief Wellness Officer at UCI, whoever we get, whenever we get them, needs to take a proactive, prepared, prevention focus and make sure that it's integrated within social determinants of health. So we're always looking at the structural issues related to health and wellness, because there and only there are we going to find, or we're going to be able to address health equity.
Well, Dean Bowden Abala, I want to thank you for joining us this morning at the Inclusive Excellence Forum. I just want to acknowledge your leadership, both on the campus, but in the county, the state, and the country. And I know you're wearing more than one hat as dean and as a faculty member, but I'm going to resist the urge to nominate you to become Chief Wellness Officer.
So funny.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, now we'd like to move on to the next part of our program, and that's a panel discussion around the idea of the theme of this Inclusive Excellence Forum, entitled Let's Thrive Together in 2021. And I am not only pleased, but so grateful that we are joined by several members, influential members of the UCI community, to discuss important strategies and steps to consider in thriving, each and all of them, like all of us, have been experiencing and working through the cascade of effects over the past year. They are part of the community, a part of us, and they bring incredible insight into how we thrive in 2021. They have significant resumes and accomplishments, and my brain can't contain all the information. And so my introduction is going to be brief. Our panelists include Chief Human Resources Executive and Associate Chancellor Ramona Agrella, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Willie Banks, Vice Chancellor for Academic Personnel and Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor in the Department of Developmental and Cell Biology, Diane O'Dowd, Associate Vice Chancellor for Wellness and Health and Counseling Services and Student Affairs, Dr. Marcel Hayashida, Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in the Grad Division and Professor of English, Rodrigo Lazo, and the Associate Dean in the Division of Teaching and Excellence and Innovation and Professor of Teaching in the Department of Molecular Biology and Biochemistry, Dr. Brian Sato. And so there are many of you and one of me, but I'm going to ask one question. One thing that has become abundantly clear from the experience of COVID is that UCI is not only a remarkable research institution and a learning organization, but we're also a social organization that's fundamentally organized around people who are diverse. And so my question to all of you, and I will randomly pick on you, is this. What are we doing now? What are we doing now that helps us when we all return to the physical spaces at UCI? And as you think about this question, think about what we've learned. To what extent will we be different? What are ways in which we'll continue our practices that predated the COVID pandemic? And so I'd like to first start with our Chief Human Resources Executive and Associate Chancellor, Ramona Agrella.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you for the invitation to participate on this forum. This is an austere group, and I'm very honored to be part of it. So first, what we learned or confirmed what we suspected is that our coworkers are amazing. They overnight, many of us went from an on-site operation to that of a virtual operation. And we just did it. It just happened. We saw innovation, dedication, and teamwork. Overall, we did not see productivity didn't drop, and we saw strong commitment to get done what needed to get done. However, as we look towards the future, we need to be cautious that it will not look like it did before we left. It'll be a different environment. Not all of us will actually be coming back to work on site. Some of us will be working in more of a hybrid environment. Some of us will be working remotely permanently. Some of us will be coming in and out of the office, sometimes working remote. So the flexibility that we learned during this COVID crisis will need to continue as we move forward. This dynamic actually creates complexities for leaders and for employees. So we're planning now to help our leaders and our employees to be prepared for what the new normal might be. We want to ensure that we have a culture of collaboration, engagement, and accountability. We want to ensure that all employees, no matter where they are or what they do, feel valued, heard, and engaged. Our unexpected virtual workplace has helped us realize that each person has their own set of challenges outside the workplace. We have witnessed our colleagues, and you might even notice it with me in a minute, juggling work with childcare, elder care, dogs, cats, pandemic fears, pressures, the list goes on. Through our exposure to our colleagues' diverse challenges, we have grown more understanding, tolerant, patient, and empathetic. We know each other to a greater extent, and that will bring us back that will stay with us as we return to normal, whatever normal looks like.
Thank you so much, Ramona. And I just want to say amen to that. I want to again underscore how enormously grateful I am to the incredible dedication of the career staff at UCI, both here at the Irvine campus as well at the Orange campus. And I next want to turn to Dr. Banks, because in some sense, like Dean Bodnabala, you joined UCI, I believe, in 2019. And I'm sure this is what you expected on the West Coast. But I'd like to hear from you about, what you've learned, because I think student affairs has just played such an indispensable role in supporting our remarkable students at this deeply disruptive time in the nation's and world's history.
Oh, absolutely. And Doug, to echo Ramona's sentiments, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this forum. And I do think that, when I accepted this position, I did not expect that we would all be in the middle of a global pandemic. I do think that the beautiful weather and the scenery in Southern California is a bonus, and not being in the Midwest right now and dealing with cold weather and flat land. So there are some bonus points for being in California. It's interesting, and I think when I think about student affairs and the work that we're doing with our students, I hope that people on this call will understand and affirm that student affairs is at the center of a lot of this work. The students that we have on campus that are living in our residence halls, those students that are in graduate family housing, the folks that are working every day in our student health center, in housing and dining, they're providing indispensable services to our students to make sure that they're still going to survive and thrive during this time. I hope that our friends on the academic side and across campus really understand and appreciate the work that we have in student affairs to really pushing the mission of the institution forward and really working with our students to make sure that they feel connected to this institution. I was just on a call yesterday, and I think one of the things that I pointed out to on this call to some students was, the work of student affairs, we are all about building community and developing the whole student. And a lot of our work would typically happen in building community on campus, either around the student center, around our residence halls, around places on campus. And we have had to really pivot and adjust and try to figure out, how do you build community in a virtual environment? And I think that has been one of the challenges for us, and not only for us, but for everyone across the campus, where we're going to have to really deal with some serious issues when we come back in the fall. We will welcome back not only a great freshman class of students, but also another class of students, our sophomores, who a majority of them have never stepped foot on campus. Wow. And that's a reality. And I think one of the things that we have to do as administrators and as professors and part of the UCI community is we cannot gloss over that fact. This past year has not been the same. And I don't think that it would be wise for us to think that we're just going to pop back to where we were before this happened. We have to acknowledge that a lot of our students have suffered great losses during this entire pandemic. And not only our students, but even people on this call. I mean, there are lots of people who have not been able to have community. And I think that's one of my biggest concerns. But I do think that I am encouraged, I'm optimistic that our people, our students, are going to be able to bounce back and to understand and to come back into community, so we can move forward and we can thrive as a community together. But I do think that we have to acknowledge up front that this past year has been rough. It has been tough. And if we try to gloss it over and say it wasn't that bad, I think our students are going to really push back on that, because there's been a lot of suffering for our students. And, I don't think anyone who signed up to go to college had signed up to go to college during a global pandemic at all. And so this has been quite disruptive, but I'm hopeful that our students can bounce back and we'll find community and we'll continue to thrive on our campus.
Well, thank you so much for those observations, because, one key takeaway is the opportunity when we return to reimagine community in light of this experience, to strengthen the bridge between student affairs and the academic core, so that we're working in collaboration around scaffolding the success of our students. And I want to next turn to my colleague, Vice Provost Diana Dowd, who oversees academic personnel with a terrific team of career professionals. How do you see the experience of COVID, and how will we be different, and what are ways in which we might not change that much?
Hi, Doug. Thanks for including me. Um, there are several important lessons that I feel that I've learned during this time period. And the first, and it echoes something that Ramona said, is that it's really important to acknowledge the extra effort that everyone is making and to thank them for what they're doing. So I want to thank everyone out there for the contributions that they've made during this really difficult time. And to remember that when we come back in the future, we often don't thank people for what they're doing. And so to continue to actually acknowledge and thank people for what they're doing, I think is very important. Second, to make sure that lines of communication are open at all levels and that we really listen to each other. Something that I think or my team thinks might be really useful or helpful without the input from the people that we are putting that in place for is really an effort that is not well spent. So to really listen to our colleagues. And finally, something personally that I've learned is that when I have even one extra ounce of energy, that I should make sure that I say yes and do more to help others with less opportunity and more constraints than I have. So I'm really fortunate to have grown children who actually help support me through this period. They make me laugh, they listen to my challenges, and they help me talk through solutions. So many of you out there are navigating this time in much more difficult circumstances. You have young children who need support, both at school and how to cope with isolation, family members with health issues that make them more at risk at even this very risky time. So I'm trying to remember my privilege when considering whether to say yes to another committee or program and make sure that I choose activities that support change in culture to reduce disparities and opportunity.
Wow. Thank you so much, Diane. I think another theme that I'm resonating with is empathy. As we imagine when we return, that this experience should elevate our sensibility around empathy. And empathy is something that can be practiced regardless of our role and responsibility. And I want to next turn to a colleague who does so much for so many people and really is at the center of wellness efforts at UCI, particularly now. And that is Associate Vice Chancellor for Wellness, Health, and Counseling Services and Student Affairs, Dr. Marcel Hayashida. Marcel, how are you doing? And I really would love to get your insight because I think you are at a very pivotal place at this time.
Oh, how am I doing? Yeah, well, I have a fifth grader who's on a lunch break from school right now, husband who's ill in the other room, parents I haven't seen in over a year. But I got a Nordic track bike in my house, and I get up and most mornings and try to do some yoga or some biking, or I took a walk yesterday, and so we're trying to, keep it together. And I think we're doing a good job. But like Dr. Banks said earlier, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's all kinds of reasons to be optimistic around the vaccine, around seeing our families. But we need to acknowledge that I think some of the themes that we're seeing with our students right now are around grief and loss, right? Grieving over the things that they couldn't get to experience senior year, first year of college, a thriving, bustling campus life that we all know existed just a year ago. But they're grieving, family members who've passed away from COVID or from other issues. They have experienced housing insecurity or food insecurity. It's hard to be in school and to have headphones and to have people in the other room who are walking around and making noise and distracting us. So I think we're doing okay. Our students are certainly showing lots of resilience. But we know that there are certain practices that help to make us more resilient and things that we need to do, like exercise and paying attention to nutrition and volunteering, right? I love what Dr. O'Dowd was saying about finding a way to be of use and to be of service, to practice gratitude, social support, journaling, getting good sleep. These are all the things that we need, that even the healthiest among us, need to really be drawing on. And as far as I think the campus, the pandemic has taught us a lot about self-care, certainly, but also I think about community care. That we are really only as strong as our sickest member, right? That you can stay in your house a lot, but go out to get takeout. And if the person preparing your food doesn't have health insurance or doesn't have access to testing, right? You're only as strong as kind of the sickest member of your bubble, of your circle, of your social sphere. So I think we're realizing in this pandemic that, how connected we are, how our health, your health affects me, the health of the building, right? And the airflow affects, all the people I work with. We're realizing that people stuck in their houses, that domestic violence is rising, that we're all connected, that this pandemic is really peeling back the layer on just how interconnected our systems are. I'll end with one remark. Nikita Valerio, who is in Canada, an activist in Canada, said, shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. So I think we're talking a lot about self-care, but I think we also, the pandemic has revealed that community care is perhaps even more important.
Thank you so much for that. And I think a theme that I'm taking away is the importance of community care, but also community care means being aware of all the community, right? Asking the question, who is our community? Are they thriving? How do we know? And how can we improve? And I think this is particularly relevant, particularly for our graduate and professional students who, of course, aren't undergraduates, but are farther advanced. They have responsibilities with their degree programs, their futures in terms of their careers. And I next want to turn to my colleague, Professor of English and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Rodrigo Lazo, who just joined the graduate division at the beginning of this year, I believe. Can you reflect on the experience today and what can we expect tomorrow once we get through this pandemic?
Yeah, gracias, Doug, for including me in this panel. And I have been really energized by seeing something happen on campus in the last few months, and it's the following: that despite the challenges posed by COVID, and what I had first feared was the possibility that a lot of our initiatives and goals that we were working on at UCI would just fall by the wayside as we went into crisis mode. Rather than that happen, we have continued to maintain a commitment to certain goals. And among that are the goals of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which are part of what my work is at graduate division, but I think that a lot of other offices are doing on this campus. That has not fallen by the wayside. We continue to remember that UCI is a Hispanic serving institution, has been, it's a federal designation, but it also calls on us to reflect on what that means for our campus, for example. The fact that graduate division decided to appoint someone in the position that I'm in right now, in the middle of this pandemic, shows a commitment on the part of the university and Dean Jillian Hayes to continue to do that work. We've improved remarkably in terms of our graduate demographics over the last 10 years, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. On the positive side, graduate division is very committed to continue to help our students, some of whom are hurting for a variety of reasons. Graduate education, as you know, stressful as it is without a pandemic and all these other political and social changes that we're facing. And we're committed to not only continuing to diversify our graduate student population, but also to support those students who are here, particularly those who have been challenged as a result of the research has been affected as a result of COVID. And so whether it's through various efforts that we're putting together to help people complete their degrees, or through new plans for the future, we are not letting go of this very important commitment that the Office of Inclusive Excellence, I think, is showcasing here today. I will just share with you a positive element here. Our applications for graduate doctoral programs, the underrepresented minority applications are up by 40% this year. There may be a variety of different reasons for that. I just hope that it translates into continuing our excellent work on diversifying our graduate student population. So again, thanks for asking me to be part of this.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I really appreciate it. And next, I want to turn to Dr. Brian Sato, who's the Associate Dean of the Division of Teaching and Learning. And I think at the core of what we do here at UCI is teach and learn and work. And Brian, I'm particularly interested to get your sort of reflections on where we are today, because, you know, we're looking broadly for talented young people to come to UCI to maximize their potential. And as has been noted by Dr. Banks and Dr. Hayashida and others, this is a challenging time. What are we doing inside the class now, and to what extent will it be different when we return so we can help our students maximize their potential?
Thank you, Doug, for the invitation. And yeah, I want to reiterate what many panelists already said, that we're doing a tremendous amount of work on campus. So that includes our faculty and instructors to make sure that our students are still getting a top-notch education. And so we in the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation have had the privilege of working with hundreds of faculty to bring their courses online. And something interesting that I realized is what we're seeing is a lot of reflection around teaching, which is interesting because unfortunately, typically teaching and reflection don't go hand in hand. Typically we teach the way that we were taught and we just sort of do it because that's the way that it's always been done. And so we recognized when folks were moving their classes online, the first questions we got were, well, how do I do this in an online space? But as time passed, I think people started to think more about, well, why do I do the things that I do? And is this the best way to structure my students' learning? And so we at DTI, we tried to provide tips to help faculty transform their courses to continue to maintain this high quality education for our students. So for example, a traditional class often prioritizes independence, whereas Dr. Banks mentioned that community is a major issue here. So something we tried to do was make sure that faculty are structuring group work and collaboration in their courses. Another example is oftentimes assessment happens with one giant exam or one giant paper. But we realized in pandemic times, emergencies happen all the time, technology issues happen all the time. So instead, really emphasizing the faculty that maybe you should have smaller assignments that are worth less and relieve some of that stress. And so these are all things that were known to be beneficial for student learning pre-pandemic, particularly for minoritized student populations. But these are things that a lot of faculty started adopting only during the pandemic when they gave teaching quite a bit more reflection. So I know one thing everyone wants to do when the world goes back to normal is just to forget all of this happened and try to go back to the way things were. But as folks mentioned, that's not what we want. And we at DTI, we're really going to be working over the next year or two to remind faculty of what it is that they've been doing in the classroom, the new policies they've created, the new materials they've made, the new discussions they've started having with colleagues across the country. And so rather than moving backwards, we're going to continue to innovate here on campus.
Thank you so much, Brian. I want to urge members of the audience, if you have questions you'd like to share, I'm happy to sort of communicate your question with our esteemed panel. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left before our next segment of our program. And so whoever is first gets the last word. While I'm waiting for that, I want to sort of provide some summary points. I think as we look ahead, we learn from our current experience. At the core of that is we need to build a better community, a community of care, a community that's grounded in empathy, a community that's focused as much on the classroom as it is in the residential hall. A community that bridges important components of the campus, for example, between the Division of Student Affairs and the academic units. That we work together instead of competing. But above all, we want to work together to promote thriving for everyone, because as Dr. Hayashida pointed out, that our sense of community is defined by the most vulnerable person and the extent to which that they have the scaffolding to succeed. Community is not does not contradict excellence. Community broadens the contours of excellence so that more motivated, achievement-oriented individuals can truly benefit from the remarkable resources at this great public research university. So colleagues, I want to thank you all for making the time. I know you have other Zoom meetings to attend, but I look forward to seeing you at the town hall meeting, I'm sure, at 1 p.m. with Chancellor Gilman. But thank you, panelists, and we'll pivot to our next segment of our Inclusive Excellence Annual Forum. We want to be sure at the annual forum on inclusive excellence to bring together multiple voices and viewpoints. And I'm particularly grateful that today we have the opportunity to engage with our student leaders who I've invited to sort of reflect on this whole year. I want to first note that unfortunately, the ASUCI president, Michelle Malari, will be unable to attend because she's under the weather. We send her our well wishes, but we also are very happy to introduce the president of the Associate Graduate Students, Connor Strobel, to really reflect on the experience this year and what the future bodes for us, for graduate students, and the ways in which the campus can support thriving for all students. Connor, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the team at OIE, the speakers earlier today, and for the 100 plus of you still in attendance through the whole thing. The breadth of your support, I mean, not just today, but throughout this whole pandemic, and for those of you who've been part of the community longer than that, you are essential fixtures to that. So thank you. And sort of in thinking about my remarks today around the question of what does it mean for a community, or more specifically, a community of students to thrive, the nature of the question has the benefit and challenge of being a far from novel question, in the sense that the benefit is that with each iteration of the question, as we go through, as we have this annual event where we talk about, thriving in other spaces on our campus or elsewhere, it affords the opportunity for marginalized communities bit by bit to express their needs to those who empower, or those who, are trying to figure out how every day they can get more and more off the sidelines and part of the change. But the challenge is, despite the sort of stochastic steps towards progress, that we find many of the biggest obstacles to truly and holistically thriving to be more recalcitrant despite our efforts. And I suggest to you all that this means that progress, in its aggregate, is not something attainable slowly or solely through the momentum of slow gains to different communities. But at the university, the constraints to change are made probably as abundantly clear as possible during today's pandemic and sort of responding economic downturn. And it does obviously punctuate, the costs of poverty to low-income students and staff, or the impact of pre-existing challenges like inconsistent access to broadband or access to assistive technologies. But it also highlights how little universities broadly and here know or have sought to know about their communities. To challenge us more, we don't have a great understanding about even how many disabled students are on our campus. But we've begun to recognize how important it is to know the community if you want to serve the community. Because we err when we come up short from our responsibility to suppose to know what's best without centering our goals around the needs as expressed by those in need. Similar to what Dr. O'Dowd said a few minutes ago. To quote from Dr. Malcolm's earlier remarks, if you can't see it, you can't deal with it. And that sort of really resonated with me sort of as I listened to the many panelists today. As our understanding of the challenges becomes increasingly clear and we endeavor to, I guess, in an opaque way, step towards the horizon of the real, sort of what we hope, we can get as close to a perfect, thriving community. We must simultaneously redouble our efforts to utilize the pillars and best practices that has sort of made UCI such a remarkable place amongst universities. When we're doing that, we're finding sort of new ways to sort of redouble those efforts today, throughout the year, specific about the pandemic, I know as someone earlier remarked, in response to the spring with the assassination of unarmed Black Americans, the Black Thriving Initiative being a pillar of, our prime example of how to redouble the instruments we have for change in equity. But at the same time, we must also, as leaders, be vulnerable to the proposition that the models we use for change might not be as appropriate for the time as they might have been before. By which I mean, we must, as the great scholar Cornel West said, be an extremist for love. Meaning that that our fidelity to each other must supersede our fidelity to doing what we've done, or as we've done it. Our response to the pandemic has shown why that matters, finding new and more personalized ways of helping those in our community who are having too much of today's burdens. To change the pillars of the university is immensely difficult, slow, tedious, but all the more necessary to address today's manifestations of perennial problems. So to return to the question, to make our community thrive means to scale up our commitments to one another, just like we're doing today. To deploy the strength of UCI to that commitment, but also be audacious enough to appropriately change how we engage with one another as an institution, as individuals within our community, in order to love better. And I recognize that I have not, probably within my remarks, spoken to some of the specific challenges. And Michelle, my better half, is always a better job at sort of reining me in. So I'm sorry for all of you that you had to deal with that. But I think regardless, thank you to all in the audience who've worked tirelessly, again, throughout the pandemic to help maintain and strengthen our community and the student community. But with that, I'll turn it back to today's conveners, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you.
Thank you so much, Connor. And I think you made some observations that I think resonate. It seems to me that there are 4 questions that, and there are probably many more, but there are essentially 4 questions that each of us as individuals, regardless of our role and function, should be mindful of. Who is our community? Are they thriving? How do we know? And what can we do? I think those 4 questions are a good starting place. They're a good starting place to be aware. They're a good starting place to engage, to learn from various communities that make up UCI. They're questions that cause us and require us to ask, how do we know people are thriving here? And 4th, how do we improve? How do we improve in serving our remarkable undergraduates and graduate students? How do we improve to serve our accomplished and dedicated career staff and faculty? How do we improve in engaging with the surrounding communities that we serve? And at the core of this, you can call it a mission, you can call it a fierce love, but above all, it's about building a thriving community, not for some of us, but for all of us. And so with that, and I realize we have just about less than 10 minutes, I want to do three things. First and foremost, I want to genuinely thank each of you for being mindful, for registering, for being aware and being engaged at this annual Inclusive Excellence Forum. It matters that we're in community, that we're participating together. I want to thank in particular our featured speakers today, including Dr. Shirley Malcolm of AAAS and the director of Sea Change, the dean of the Gross School of Population Health and Public Health, Dr. Bernadette Bolden Abala, for setting the context about COVID, the social consequences, and letting us know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I want to also thank the team at the Office of Inclusive Excellence, including Assistant Vice Chancellor Margaret Bonet-Hammerth, Mary-Jo Ibale, Tuda Yi, Joseph Morales, Roxy Silver, and others. I want to ask you to consider the following actions. Learn more about the Inclusive Excellence Action Plan that's available on our website. We're updating and improving it each day. We welcome your comments, your questions, your recommendations and suggestions. More than anything else, I want to urge you to complete the UCI climate survey that was just launched today. That climate survey consists of about 10 minutes worth of questions that are organized around the pillars of the action plan: community, thriving, and wellness. We need to hear from you. We need to hear from your coworkers, your student peers. We need to hear from you because we need to know how we can improve. How can we improve the sense of community? How can we improve the sense of thriving? How can we improve wellness? I think it's fair to say that as a result of the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the ongoing national reckoning about anti-Black racism, that those pillars of community, thriving, and wellness matter more than ever before. They also provide a framework for our future together. So please take 10 minutes, complete that climate survey, and it really does matter if you can reach out to your student peers, to your coworkers and colleagues, and encourage them to complete that survey as well. And finally, I want to recognize the many individuals that are serving this campus in a variety of ways, but they all are inclusive excellence champions. And I want to acknowledge the members of the UCI Equity Advisors. This is our 20th anniversary, and I want to acknowledge those equity advisors who are currently in the role, as well as the over 200 that have served over the past 2 decades. This is also the 10th year in a few months of the Decade Mentors Program, which is modeled on the Equity Advisor model. And these are faculty members who serve their graduate programs to advance inclusive excellence. I also want to acknowledge many of you who have participated in the Inclusive Excellence Certificate program. Well over 300 people have completed this certificate program since it was launched last year. It really does matter because it's a terrific way to learn about the campus while creating community to improve UCI. And finally, I want to acknowledge all of you who have engaged with the UCI Black Thriving Initiative. And that initiative includes many ways for all of us, regardless of what we do at UCI, to participate in creating a university culture where Black people thrive. This is all important during this month of Black History Month. So please visit the Black Thriving website. Learn about the Black Thriving Pledge. Consider enrolling in the suite of courses that are designed to understand anti-Blackness in the United States. And above all, remember that what we do benefits everyone. The Black Thriving Initiative builds on our success as a Latinx thriving university, as an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving university, as a campus that serves so many diverse people. To think about another way, the Black Thriving Initiative is about Black people thriving because of their intersectional identities, by being not only Black, but gay and transgender and straight, by being first generation or low income, by coming from different parts of California or the country or the world. So finally, I want to thank you again for being in community. I think we have just enough time for you to sort of transition into the town hall with Chancellor Gilman. But again, we're in this together, and I'm looking forward to a better 2021. Thank you so much.